Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Points, the podcast where every week we talk about Knoxville politics, government, business, education, news, golf, kind of anything that gets our attention. My name's Jesse Mayshark. I am co-publisher and co-founder of Compass at CompassKnox.com. Joined remotely this week. This week's a little bit complicated, so we're having to record remotely because there's just so much stuff going on. Joined by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing great today. It's Thursday morning this week instead of Friday, and beautiful day. Big Ears is getting ready to start, so I'm good to go.
Yeah, and we are going to talk a little bit about the Big Ears Festival here in a minute. But before we get to that fun stuff, we have some actual governmental and civic matters to discuss. This was a fairly busy week in many respects. There was a summit hosted by both the city and county mayor about issues dealing with homelessness. We had a story about how the school system is reporting and using discipline data that we'll talk about a little bit. City Council, once again, spent some time not so much talking about, but listening to people talk about the crisis in Gaza, and we will talk about that. But to start off, I thought we would talk a little bit about Commissioner Larson J. and his battle against abandoned and underused utility poles. So Commissioner J, he's one of the two at-large commissioners on County Commission. He's been working on this for several months, and he has this month brought to County Commission both a resolution and an ordinance, both dealing with this issue of utility poles essentially left abandoned in the right-of-way. And this is something that probably all of us see on a regular basis, maybe so regularly that we kind of don't notice them. But what he's talking about here are when an older pole has maybe either become dilapidated, in some cases broken, or for whatever reason, the pole owner in that location has come in and put in a brand new pole. Sometimes these days, this is replacing an old wooden pole with a new metal pole, which of course are more durable. But then a lot of times, either not everything gets moved from the old pole to the new pole. We'll talk about that in a minute because the logistics of this are actually sort of complicated. And then in some cases, everything, all the lines and wires do get moved from the old pole onto the new pole. And then the old pole just sits there right next to the new pole, just kind of, forever. This is something that Commissioner J says that he became aware of over time, just kind of driving around and kind of noticing all these poles sitting there and thinking, why do we have all of these poles sitting around? Shouldn't somebody do something about this? And so what he's proposed is two different things. There's a resolution that basically County Commission would be asking all of our local pole owners and users, which is basically our local utility companies and telecommunications companies, to meet every 3 months, meet quarterly with county staff to review the identified poles, that are out there that people acknowledge need to be removed, and basically provide a report on here's how many poles we were able to remediate in the last quarter, and here's what we plan to do in the next quarter. So it would be sort of just having a meeting and getting everybody, coordinating those efforts. Then there's an ordinance, and the ordinance clearly looks to be the more controversial of these two items because it has some enforcement teeth. And it is really aimed at specifically poles that are identified as being immediate hazards. And so these would be more like the ones that are broken and maybe leaning out into an intersection and that kind of thing. You do see an actual sort of alarming number of those around town. And that basically once county engineering identified those poles and provided notification to the pole owner that, hey, this is a hazard and you got to do something about it, that pole owner would have, there's a couple of time frames, but essentially they would have 14 days to present a remediation plan and say, yes, here's what we're going to do, and to, take care of it quickly. If they didn't take care of it quickly and say the county decided they had to go in and do it themselves, then there would be penalties that could kick in. The pole owners could be billed for the cost of the county's work. And the thing that I think has really made a lot of the pole owners unhappy about this proposal is it would potentially allow the county to not issue any more permits to those pole holders until they dealt with their issues, or even revoke existing permits for them to have poles in the right of way, because all of these utility poles that we see, they are in public right of way. And that public right of way is owned either by the city, if it's within city limits, or by the county outside city limits, or by the town of Farragut in their city limits. But that is public property. It belongs to the public. And Jay's basic concern and complaint here is that this is public property we're allowing these private entities to use because it serves, a public need for power and communication and Netflix and all of the things that we get that come across our various communication lines. And therefore, we, the public, should have, some say and some recourse if we think people are abusing that privilege. So County Commission talked about this at their work session this past Monday. They will be voting on both of those, the resolution and the ordinance, at their meeting this coming Monday. And from the discussion, it sounded like the resolution to have those quarterly meetings, that's something that everybody sounds like they're okay with. There were representatives from both AT&T and KUB who spoke at this meeting, and they kind of said, sure, well, we'd have quarterly meetings and go over the data and talk about what our plans are. AT&T in particular really didn't like the ordinance, and they suggested at a minimum, delaying that for a year or so to see if this other system, more cooperative system without those enforcement teeth, works to do what the county wants. And the representative of AT&T that was there, Alan Hill, who's the regional director for AT&T here, also not so subtly threatened possible legal action if they pass the ordinance, kind of said that, under state and federal law, telecommunications companies have a lot of rights to use public property. And he didn't specify exactly what he thought the ordinance might be violating in those, but just kind of tried to cast a cloud over it, saying, you may be stepping on our toes here in terms of what our existing rights are, and we would be willing to contest those if needed. So, kind of saying, hey, we want to be cooperative, but also, we might sue you if you do something we don't like. So, Scott, this is just an interesting conversation, I think, because it's one of these things a lot of us probably just take for granted. We see these poles everywhere, and we don't think about how complicated this whole system is, because the poles are actually owned by many different entities. The utility companies are the biggest owners, KUB in its area, and Lenore City Utilities Board out in West Knox County. But then AT&T owns some of its own poles. Some of the other telecommunications providers own some of their own poles in places where they've, it's been necessary for their networks to go and put them in. And then you have multiple people using all of these poles. And so they all have user agreements, on a KUB pole, you might have AT&T and Comcast. And then, of course, you have KUB's own internet lines now that are on those. And so you'll have multiple people on any given pole. That's one of the complexities here, is that like if KUB comes in and puts in a new pole, they will move their stuff over to that pole, but they won't move everybody else's stuff. I don't think under their agreements they're even allowed to move everybody else's stuff. Like everybody's responsible for their own stuff. And so one thing, this is something that Jay talked about, you get these poles where, a new pole is put in and half the lines are moved over to it. And then a year later, the other half the lines are still hanging there on that old pole just because they haven't gotten around to it. It's not a top priority for any of these companies to kind of consistently and those old poles are eventually supposed to be removed by the person who owns them. But if KUB owns that pole and Comcast is still hanging on it, they can't do anything until Comcast moves it. And Jay's argument is that we don't have a mechanism right now to kind of make all of that happen the way it's supposed to happen, with the result that we have just under 3,000 poles countywide, unnecessary, just kind of sitting out there, littering up the right of way and potentially creating, hazards if they happen to fall into the intersection or if somebody drives off the road. Basically, the more things there are in the right of way to collide with, the more likely somebody is going to collide with them. So there's some public safety concern there too.
Yeah, in the in the whole, there's no in the scenario you talked about with KUB building it, putting up a new pole and Comcast staying on the old pole. There's really no incentive for Comcast to move it because it costs money to move it,
right?
And it would not. I don't know the ins and outs of all these agreements, and they're all different, and it's a very, very complex. I mean, you can have one pole, and you can have 4 different users on that pole, and they each have a different agreement with the owner of the pole. I mean, it's very, very complex. But if Comcast, first of all, they would have to pay to move the line, and then they also might have to pay more under a new agreement to attach to the new pole. I mean, who knows? I don't know. But I mean, there are all kinds of complexities there. There's no incentive to do that. I mean, if it's going to, if I'm Comcast and I've got these lines and KUB puts in a new pole and they want me to move and it's going to cost me X amount of dollars that I haven't budgeted this year, I'm not going to do it. I might do it next year when we have a new budget year, but it's not in my budget this year, so I'm not going to do it. And I'm not saying Comcast does that. It's just kind of a possible example.
And that is, I mean, that was exactly Jay's argument, that like this doesn't generate revenue for them and it's just an extra cost and they don't want to do it. And so they are clearly slow to do it. It's not that it doesn't happen. Poles do get removed. And that was one thing Aaron Gill from KUB, said at the meeting, that a few years ago, KUB did realize that their backlog of poles to be removed had gotten too large. And she says they've been working diligently to address that and have actually removed about 2,000 poles in the last couple of years. And, so that was kind of the argument from the utility and telecom company side was, hey, we hear you. And, we're going to take this seriously, but let's work together and let's not have this thing where we might lose our permits. We don't really want. And, I think it is from what I have heard, some of the telecom companies have been lobbying members of county commission about this pretty assiduously. And this is something that the telecom companies do. They are very protective of their rights in the rights of way, both dealing with local governments and state governments. They really are kind of 800-pound gorilla is understating it. And
they're very diligent in the lobbying.
Yeah.
And diligent is kind of an understatement of that. They really when anything that has to do with telecommunications, those companies are assertive as you on their lobbying efforts. So I imagine that county commissioners are getting their ears bent quite heavily leading up to to this. So but you're right. I mean, you do see these everywhere.
Yeah.
When you drive around, and some of them do look pretty dangerous.
Yeah, that was one thing. Jay had a slideshow to kind of drive the point home of polls in every single commission district, just to kind of, try to make the point to his fellow commissioners, like, this is everywhere. It's everybody's problem. And some of them were just, abandoned polls standing there with no lines on them next to another poll. So clearly that poll doesn't need to be there. Some of them were like almost broken in two, but still with the power lines moved off them, but still with some telecommunications lines running across them, again, right next to a new pole that's been installed, because they just haven't gotten around to it. So, we'll see at Monday's commission meeting how it shakes out. It did, the overall tenor of the conversation, I would say, at Monday's work session made it seem likely that there's support for the resolution to kind of have these quarterly meetings and try to keep everybody focused on it. Maybe less support for the ordinance, and I think that's clearly what AT&T was pushing for. Was fine, go ahead and do the resolution. Let's hold off on the ordinance. We'll see how that plays out, and whether even without the ordinance, having raised the issue and created a mechanism to have ongoing conversation about it, Jay can still achieve a lot of what he's trying to do, which is to not let this be something that all these companies can just sort of ignore, let them know.
Yeah, well, it's kind of one of these things where, okay, even if they don't pass the ordinance, it's kind of like, okay, you guys, speed this up, or we'll pass an ordinance. I mean, you can, that can always be the stick that is that they hold in reserve. And to see what the owners and the telecom companies do.
Yep. And one thing just to mention here, we were talking about the political savvy of the telecommunications companies. That includes the fact that one county commissioner actually works for the telecommunications companies. Commissioner Courtney Durrett handles external, community relations for Comcast in this region. However, she is not lobbying her fellow commissioners on it. That would, in fact, be a violation of open meetings laws, at least if she did it, one-on-one. And she's also recused herself from the conversation and from voting on it and everything. But again, just a sign of the telecom companies being well connected with local and state governments.
Oh, absolutely.
All right. Well, moving from a fairly, banal, I suppose, but kind of interesting local issue to a not at all banal global issue. City Council again this week had a resolution on the crisis in Gaza. So we went through this just a few months ago, Scott, where there was a resolution that didn't get any traction on council. What happened in round two?
It got this is a new resolution. It got no more traction than the last one did. Mm-hmm. The council member pushing this is Amelia Parker. She had a resolution in November calling for a ceasefire and condemning Israel's actions in Gaza as war crimes. This time around, the resolution, and they went to stay on the November meeting. It was very contentious. There were the people from the Palestinian community in Knoxville, people from the Jewish community in Knoxville, packed the main assembly room in the city county building. Lots of yelling and chanting and acrimony. Very raucous meeting, one of the most raucous city county meetings I've ever attended. What happened was, when it came time for council to actually consider it, no one seconded the motion that Parker made to approve it, so it died. It was very kind of, all this build up, and then it just, nope, we're not even voting on it, not even talking about it. Council members didn't even discuss it. This time around, the resolution is based was based on the International Court of Justice had ruling, basically saying that it looks like Israel is committing genocide, and we're going to be investigating it. And the resolution essentially agreed with that, and called for a ceasefire. Although Parker during the meeting said, "Well, this one doesn't call for a ceasefire." Well, the language, it's kind of one of those looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. But you're not going to call it a duck, because it basically says, okay, anything that could result in killing Palestinians or causing bodily harm to Palestinians, needs to stop. So that's kind of like ceasefire, because the weapons are the things that are causing bodily harm and death. So, but anyway, once again, the Knoxville's Palestinian community and Knoxville's Jewish community showed up in great numbers. It wasn't, passions were still high. It wasn't as, it wasn't as raucous, I guess, that's the only word that keeps coming into my head, as it was in November. But it was still, there was still a lot of tension. There was still a lot of yelling. This time, Parker did speak on why she wanted to pass this, and actually, Vice Mayor Tommy Smith and Council Member Simon Singh also spoke. Even though there wasn't even a motion on the floor, they spoke, and Smith laid out his reasons for not supporting this, and that basically, we've got a lot to do in Knoxville. This is an international thing. We have nobody's going to listen to us. Nobody's going to, it doesn't really matter. So we've got a lot of discrimination and social justice things to work on here. Kind of pointedly, saying, look at the crowd, there's a lot to, we need to work through, and we need to work through things here in Knoxville. And then when it came time for Parker to make a motion to approve it, she did. And again, no one seconded the motion, so there was not even a vote on it. So one of the things that was kind of interesting and a very controversial at the meeting among people in the audience was that the crowd was huge, and they got there early. And what happened was the people in the Jewish community and their supporters got there first. And, there aren't assigned seats in the city council in the main assembly room, and they filled up about 3/4 of the seats in the ground floor. And then the Palestinians and their Palestinian Americans and their supporters had the other batch. But there were a lot of especially Palestinian supporters out in the lobby, and they couldn't get in. There's a limit there, and they didn't open up the balcony of the city county building. Mayor Kincannon said, the public building authority and the fire marshal decided not to open up the balcony out of safety concerns. The people who supported the Palestinians did not buy that at all. They thought that they were being that their supporters were being blocked out. Parker made a comment on the dais to the mayor, talking, strongly objecting to it. Several people in the Palestinian supporters yelled at the media. Were demanding they came in. And in fact, the people who were out in the lobby waiting to come in were chanting loud enough to be heard inside the building while the council was trying to do their business. So one thing that that Smith brought up was that resolutions like this are can be divisive, and it was certainly divisive on Tuesday night when they met. I mean, it was, but there was one kind of tidbit that came out that might have gotten lost in the shuffle. I mean, we didn't, it's Mayor Kincannon recently met with leaders of the Jewish community and leaders Muslim community, and to talk about this and try to work through this. And so they're, in some quarters there is dialogue, but not when it comes to these. And this was it's a non-binding resolution, but it was very symbolic, and it just goes to show how deep the animosity is, and it extends not just in Gaza and in Israel, but it's here too. So.
Yeah, and I think that point about it being divisive in the community is an interesting one, because obviously, our local bodies vote on things that are divisive all the time, whether it's land use issues or other kinds of policies or ordinances. And so it's not that they can avoid ever dealing with something divisive. But I guess the concern is that when something's going to be very divisive and create a lot of bad feelings, maybe one way or the other, and also you're not going to actually, as you say, accomplish anything, then I think that probably becomes the thing that, individual council members have to weigh, like, what's the value of wading into this versus what we can actually accomplish. And as you say, this is symbolic. It's especially symbolic because really what the resolution was calling for was for our federal representatives, our Congressman Tim Burchett and our senators Marsha Blackburn and Bill Hagerty, to put pressure on the Biden administration, to put pressure on Israel, because that's the leverage that we have, right? But we all know, based on the public positions and statements of our actual federal representatives, Burchett and Blackburn and Hagerty, they're not going to do that. They have been staunch, much more than President Biden. They have been, our congressional representatives have been staunch supporters of Israel and what it's doing in Gaza. And so the notion that because a Knoxville city council passes something that is going to influence, what Burchett or Blackburn or Hagerty do in relation to dealing with the Biden administration, it's just not very likely. And so it is. Now, that's not to say that there's not value, right, in symbolic statements. And there are lots of local governmental bodies around the country and in other countries who have made statements about this. And I think from probably the activist standpoint, this is just one, piece of the broader effort to raise awareness and concern and try to shift national policy. And broadly, I think that effort has had some success, certainly not as much as the people pushing for a ceasefire want to see, because apart from some short ones, we haven't had ceasefires. But, you have started to see Vice President Kamala Harris come out and make some statements, and President Biden make some statements. So I think that the activists, are having an impact on the dialogue. And from the standpoint of being an activist on this, even pushing dialogue at a city council meeting that's not going to lead to anything getting passed still accomplishes the goal of trying to keep this front and center and make people aware of it. So you can kind of understand from an activist standpoint why you would push for this, even if you knew it wasn't going to pass, because the goal is the goal is much broader, obviously, than Knoxville City Council. At the same time, of course, you can understand the point of view of the majority of, all of the rest of the council members besides Parker, to say this isn't really our mandate.
Yeah. Well, one thing that needs to be said is both Smith and Singh, who are the only council members who spoke, and all of the speakers, the ones who were for the resolution and those who were against it, all of them agree that the violence in Gaza is absolutely horrific, and the bloodshed is absolutely horrific. Of course, the the pro-Israel faction blames Hamas. The pro-Palestinian faction blames Israel. So but they all acknowledged, that the common ground that they actually have is that everyone thinks that what is happening on the ground in Gaza is absolutely horrific. And the other thing that has kind of come up too is, when is it appropriate? And this is, obviously they can do it any time, but for any reason. But when should council call on representatives in the state government or federal government to do things? And one of the things is that makes this a little different than what they usually do is when they pass resolutions calling on the state legislature, for example, to do something. It's something that directly affects Knoxville and Knox County. It's not, this is, while there are, for example, Palestinian Americans here who've had family members killed in Gaza, and they talked about that on Tuesday. But that conflict really, doesn't have that same direct relationship to what's going on in Knox County, and I think that's a distinction that council members who did not opt to vote on this kind of thing. So,
yep, yeah, and I guess we will see if having kind of tried this twice and gotten the same result, whether Parker might continue to bring similar resolutions or might decide that it's not.
Well, she gave a hint. She said that the reaction to this resolution strengthened her resolve. So we will see in the future if there are other resolutions that come up and how the other council members react to it.
Sure. All right. Well, back here dealing with strictly local issues, we had an article this week, which you can find on our website at CompassKnox.com, and you can read it there if you are a subscriber. And if you're not a subscriber, what a great opportunity to become one. You can also go to CompassKnox.com and find all the information right there. But this has to do with discipline data and how Knox County Schools uses it. And there's some background here. Basically, there is a lot of disparity. If you just look at the statistics of students who receive out-of-school suspensions in particular, there are clear racial and economic disparities. And the school system has been aware of this for a long time. And it formed a task force 10 years ago in 2014 to take a sort of deep dive, serious look into racial and economic disparities in both discipline issues and academic achievement across the school system. And what that group found 10 years ago, and this report is still on the school system's website, you can find it there, was that, yes, there are big disparities. Basically, Black students and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were 2 to 3 times as likely as white students and students from more affluent backgrounds to be suspended from school. They also underperform academically on sort of all of the metrics, state tests and everything. And the school system for many years made an official priority of eliminating those disparities, both in disciplinary actions and in academic achievement. And part of that process was they had regular public meetings. They had sort of a series of bodies. There was a task force, then a steering committee, then an equity alliance. Like the name kind of kept changing, but it was doing more or less the same thing, which was providing regular public reports and accountability for this data. And over the course of that, which that lasted from basically about 2000, they formed the group in 2014. The first report came out in 2016. And so then they kind of had these meetings and this ongoing public accountability up until 2022, basically, when Superintendent John Ryswick took over, because this was something that started under former Superintendent Jim McIntyre, continued under his successor, Bob Thomas. And so then Ryswick came in a couple of years ago, and he essentially disbanded that group. At that point, it was called the Alliance for Equity, and it was made up of both school personnel and community members, and said, you know what, we're not going to take that approach anymore. And he has his 4 key priorities that he established at the start of his time as superintendent, which we've talked about before. And he kind of wants everything aligned with those 4 priorities. One of those priorities is success for every student, which kind of includes within it issues of, special education, English language learners, and then, our various minority subgroups and demographics. So his argument was basically, look, if we're doing all of the things that I want us to be doing in addressing every individual student's needs, then that will, in and of itself, take care, that will address these disparities. So he wasn't saying that we don't care about these racial and economic disparities anymore. He was saying that, he wants it to be part of this kind of overall holistic approach rather than something they kind of break out and provide these regular reports on. Now, a more cynical person might say, okay, sure, but also one thing that became clear over the time of having all these public reports was that basically nothing's really gotten better. They've made this a priority. They've made this a focus. And every time they came back and reported these numbers, the disparities were the same. They weren't making any progress. They weren't showing any progress. They were doing a lot of things. They actually have instituted many things within the district to try to more specifically focus on and serve the needs of those groups. So it's not that they aren't doing things, but they weren't seeing results. And so, again, if you were cynical, you could say, well, maybe they got tired of reporting numbers that they knew were just going to keep making them look bad, a couple of times a year. And the school board actually, in setting its evaluation criteria for Ryswick's job performance, they retained the issue of addressing academic disparities, kind of seeing that as very much within their core mission, something that they need to focus on. But they removed that issue of discipline disparities from the things that they grade the superintendent on. And so that led to a lot of concern in the community, including the people who had been involved in this, essentially 10 years of community effort on this. It made people nervous that, when you take something away as an official metric, you're taking away the superintendent's incentive to kind of stay focused on it. And when you stop reporting numbers publicly, which they did, basically we didn't have a report for a couple of years. If you're not reporting them, how do we know what's going on? And so a couple of school board members, Reverend John Butler, who represents the first district, which includes essentially kind of almost all of East Knoxville and a lot of our urban schools, our schools with larger minority populations. He wanted, and he was involved in the original effort to get the task force started back in 2014. He and board member Daniel Watson and a few others have made the case that, regardless of whether or not we grade the superintendent on this, we still want to see the numbers. The community wants to see the numbers. We think it's important that we keep tracking this. A little bit like we were talking about with the telephone polls, right? Or the utility polls with Commissioner Jay, the idea that if nobody's tracking it and if nobody's regularly trying to hold people to account for it, I can kind of slide off the radar in terms of things people are paying attention to. So Justice Knox, which is a group that I think, Scott, we're going to be talking about again here in a couple of minutes. They're involved in lots of things, but Justice Knox is an interdenominational group of church congregations here in Knoxville and Knox County that has been active for several years now on sort of a range of social justice issues. But one of the things that they have been focused on is school discipline and the need to move from a model that is more about punishing students and removing them from academic settings and toward a model of restorative intervention, which is something that the school system officially at least embraces, where instead of it just being about punishing a student, you kind of take a student who has had behavioral issues or whatever and really talk with them and work with them to recognize and address what underlying issues there may be there. Kind of a quote unquote whole child approach to dealing with students, which again is very much in line with Ryswick's own. I mean, Ryswick argued that he's a pioneer of the whole child approach in Knox County Schools. When he was principal of Fulton High School, that they implemented that and that it had a big impact on reducing their suspensions and so forth. So it's not that he's not bought into that idea, but the concern from Justice Knox and from some of the board members is just, if we're not seeing these numbers on an ongoing basis, even if we don't, we have realistic expectations, we know that you're not going to go from having a huge gap to having no gap overnight or even in a decade. But we still think it's important to talk about it. So Justice Knox representatives came to school board meetings in February and March asking for this. And in response to that and to requests from board members, at this month's school board work session, Ryswick and Corey Lautner, who's the assistant superintendent for strategy, made a whole presentation talking in great detail about how they use discipline data, how the whole child approach works. And it was a really interesting discussion and presentation. If you're interested in this issue, I would really actually recommend going and watching that part of this month's school board work session. That work session was on March 4th. You can find it on Knoxville Community Media's YouTube channel, because it really was an interesting and detailed discussion. But as part of it, they did report the most recent discipline data numbers. And they also committed to saying, yes, we will continue to do this every semester. They're revamping the school system website right now. And they're going to have a sort of community information dashboard there, and they're going to post those numbers there. So they're not going to go back to what they were doing under previous superintendents, where they were actually having, the school system itself was having big public community meetings to talk about this, but they are going to make the information available. And I talked to Joe Maddox, who's pastor of New Hopewell Missionary Baptist Church and is co-president of Justice Knox. And he said that would be okay with him and with Justice Knox if they can get the information on a regular basis and in a consistent format so they can compare it. Then, they can hold their own public meetings, or school board members who want to hold a public discussion about it can hold that public discussion. It doesn't have to be the school system leading it, but that they need the data and that it needs to be public. And so, it was an interesting discussion, because there was some sense, I feel like, in that first year under Ryswick, not necessarily coming from the superintendent's office, but certainly from some school board members, there was a sense of kind of wanting to back away from this whole engagement with these issues of racial disparities. And I think that now they're saying, okay, yes, we will go ahead and talk about this. But also, it's important to understand that just because the numbers look bad doesn't mean that we're not trying, that there aren't efforts going on to deal with it. And I think that can be a difficult thing for government bodies sometimes, to report data on an ongoing basis that isn't going to look great. Yeah. There's a sort of natural tendency to want to downplay the stuff that doesn't look great.
Well, yeah, and this this idea of backing away from looking at issues regarding race is something that's happening. It's, not only here, it's happening in state legislature, it's happening in other states, and it's one of these things where I think a lot of it is kind of wishful thinking. That okay, if we pretend that we're all colorblind, then we will be. Right. And the data doesn't show that. So there's that. I think that's a little bit of where that idea is coming from. Is okay. We'll just act like there is that race doesn't play a factor in things like disparities in discipline or college admissions or anything else. But we will pretend, if we pretend that race doesn't have an effect, then it doesn't. And,
right. Right. And as you say, right, there's these moves at the state level in several places. We've seen some versions of it here, and we'll probably see some more of it from our legislature to literally do away with like diversity, equity, and inclusion offices at public universities or public bodies of any kind, sort of under the pretense that the actual problem with racial disparities in America is that we have too many university bureaucrats talking about racial disparities in America, and as you say, and Daniel Watson, school board member, I thought made a very good, cogent argument for this at that work session, where he acknowledged the discomfort that a lot of white people, let's be clear, because I don't think non-white people are much less leery of talking about these things. White people tend to be uncomfortable, and white policy makers and politicians and so forth. And, Watson said, look, like, it's okay to be uncomfortable talking about this stuff. It's okay to acknowledge that we have these disparities, and basically, as you're saying, not talking about them doesn't make them go away. We didn't talk about them for a long time, and they didn't go. Now we're talking about them, and they're still not going away. But the problem is not that we're talking about them. And, he said that this isn't unique to Knoxville and Knox County. You can find these same patterns across the whole country. It's not unique to the South. You can find these racial disparities and economic disparities across the United States. And that, as he said, that a lot of people, and I do think this is something that you will hear again, especially white politicians fall into sometimes, they feel like talking about these things is somehow blaming somebody, that like you're saying it's white people's fault, and, I never owned a slave, or I never forced somebody to use a different drinking fountain or whatever. It's not my fault. And Watson was saying, we're not saying it's your fault or your fault or your fault. Like, we all live in this country. This is a legacy we have, but we know where these disparities come from. They didn't materialize out of thin air. It's not random occurrence that we have, centuries of racial inequality in this country. It's from very specific things that have happened in our own history. And that's what this conversation ought to be about, is like, how do we collectively deal with this? Not like, white people are bad. Like, that's not really the point of these conversations.
Yeah, it's not who do we punish? It's how do we fix it?
Right, exactly. And that was their argument, was that we can't even talk about how we fix it or if we're fixing it, if we're not measuring it. And, like, ideally, right, those numbers get better at some point. And if they do get better, you would want to know that too, and figure out, like, well, why are they getting better? What's working? So anyway, we'll continue to cover this. It'll be interesting to see how that kind of data presentation gets used in the coming years and what kind of conversation there is about it. But the push by Justice Knox and Reverend Butler and some of the school board members does seem to have kind of put it at least back on it's back on the table in terms of something that will be available to look at on an ongoing basis. And Scott, speaking of Justice Knox, you covered something else this week that they were also involved in, which was this Mayor's Summit on Homelessness. What happened there?
Yeah, the Justice Knox, one of their big issues is homelessness and housing. And so they joined the City County Office of Housing Stability to hold this summit. Basically, the officials and service providers and stakeholders in the realm of trying to prevent homelessness. That's the it was kind of broadly that, but it was for basically for stakeholders. And they held it at the Foundry on Wednesday morning, and it was basically a big get together. Kind of, it's not exactly kicking off, but more or less kicking off the development of a strategic plan. The Office of Housing Stability is going to be putting together a 5-year strategic plan. Should be out sometime in the summer, but they're doing this. They're getting some other public input, trying to come up with a comprehensive approach to address homelessness and housing for especially low-income housing. So Aaron Reed, who's the director of the Office of Housing Stability, kind of was the MC of it. They had several speakers, had a forum discussion on housing. It was 4 or 5 hours of talking about what Knoxville and Knox County need to do as part of this plan that they're moving forward. And the big thing that came up was the word that kept cropping up in virtually every public utterance was collaboration. We want to make sure that that the different groups who do different things work together and understand and complement one another and not compete with one another or copy one another. Just make sure that everybody who is in this realm does that. One of the interesting things was the keynote speaker was Julia Orlando, and she's from Bergen County, New Jersey, which for those of us who are geographically challenged about the Northeast is a very urban area north of Newark and across the Hudson from New York. So it's got about 1 million residents, and she led the effort there that has actually more or less ended chronic homelessness in that community. And they've achieved what they call net zero, which means that for every person who becomes chronically homeless, somebody who is chronically homeless moves into housing. So it's kind of, the population isn't growing.
Right. It doesn't mean that there's no homeless people.
It doesn't mean there's no homelessness, but it's a notable achievement. They were the first community in the United States to do that. They have sustained it. There are several other counties that have and communities who've achieved it. Chattanooga has achieved it for veterans, for homeless veterans. So but she talked about her experience in Bergen County and things that that she did and that they did there. Some of it's different from what we do. For instance, they built a big county-owned shelter there. The county actually owns it. Here, we have nonprofits who run the overnight shelters, and they do there too. But they've got this county-owned facility as well, and they and they have different things. That's what's one thing. It's kind of like a central command post where they also these other service providers have free office space there. They've got a wellness center there. They have a nutritional program there. They do a lot of things, and it's in this centralized location in Hackensack, and it's one of the things that they do. And they also look at some of the details. One of the things that she said is she refused to accept used clothing donated for people who were homeless in Bergen County. Just refused it. And one of the thing is, it's kind of a dignity thing. They can wear new clothes, and and she talked to the people who were donating, a lot of businesses who wanted to donate used clothing. She said, "Listen, get them new clothes. what do you want to see when they're walking in front of your business? What do you want to see? And, and that was, and little things like that kind of changed the mindset of people. And she said that that's one of the things you've got to do is you've got to kind of change people's mindsets about homelessness and who is homeless and why they're homeless. Of course, that's poverty is the main reason, and they don't, they're too poor to be able to afford a place to live. There are other factors, but that's the main one. And she said that one of the things is, what most communities do is they try to manage homelessness. Or they, temporary shelter. They give them some clothing, meals, on a temporary basis. And she said that that it's all well good. You feel good to do that, but only housing ends homelessness. And talked about making sure that there was housing, that if people were homeless, did come to them for services, that on the other end of that journey there is housing. That's one of the problems that we have in Knoxville, Knox County, is this lack of housing that for people who are low income and people who are teetering on the edge, if not already over the edge on as far as homelessness goes. And they had an interesting panel discussion about that very thing. Had Ben Bentley from KCDC, Craig Cobb of the Dominion Development Group, which they build affordable housing, David Arning of the Lawson Family Foundation, and Amy Gore of Think Tennessee, the think tank. The conversation about housing and what it takes to build affordable housing. And it's a very complex thing. I mean, we've talked about this before. Cobb was saying, it's like you're putting together these financial packages. It's like a wedding cake. You've got these different layers, and they have these projects. Instead, one of the things about building affordable housing is it costs the same as market rate housing to build. So you've got to come up with ways to cut to have other people finance it besides a bank. If you build market rate housing, you go to a bank, you get a loan, you build it, you rent out the apartments and move on with your life. With affordable housing, because you have to lower the operational cost on the back end, you need a loan, but you also need some other things, some other equity. You use low income tax credits. You use subsidies from city or county government. You use all kinds of financial tools to be able to afford to do that. And as many as some projects take as many as 10 or 11 different pieces to finance. So,
and that's just financing, right? Because once you get something financed, then you need a place to put it. And I know they talked about that a bit too, right? The perennial NIMBY issue.
Yeah, the perennial NIMBY issue, that's been an issue here. Most recently really played out in Choteau, where there was going to be an affordable housing apartment community built there, and the neighbors in Choteau rose up in arms almost, figuratively in arms, but they were outraged that this community was going to come in out there and blocked it. Essentially, so the funny thing about that is, that's something that again, as Orlando was saying, you've got to change the mindset of people and how they deal with it. It's funny, we always talk about NIMBY, which is not in my backyard, as being the thing. She likes the acronym BANANA, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And there is that attitude as well. So But one of the things that Arning brought up, he was with the Lawson Family Foundation, and he was also involved in developing Flanagan Landing and Minville Manor and all that. Saying that now that they can show people that permanent supportive housing, for example, which those two developments were, can go into your community, and it's not and then people who live there will become part of your community. They're not going to be, the horror stories that they're thrown up from NIMBYism or bananas isn't really an issue, when it really happens, and that's one way there's data and evidence that shows that we can build these in any community in Knoxville, Knox County, and the people who live there will be good neighbors and an asset to their new communities.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and I think that does, we tend to think of these things as political issues. Why doesn't somebody do something, whether that's the city or the county or the state or whoever? But in a lot of ways, and we certainly saw this here in Knox County with the prior effort under the 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness, as it was called. But this really does come down to the whole community having to buy into it, because, political leadership can only do so much. And realistically, we know from watching public meetings and seeing what happens when big crowds of people show up to yell about things and so forth, that politicians are likely to respond to what they hear from their constituents. And so if mostly what they're hearing from their constituents is, hey, homelessness is a big problem, I agree, but I don't want that near me, which is the main thing that they hear from their constituents, then that's, it's going to be the relatively rare local legislator who's going to stand up against that. And that, it sounds like a lot of the discussion here is trying to push that awareness on and that responsibility onto the community as a whole, and say, these are people who live in our community. We need to have some sort of collective determination to address their needs. And if we don't, then that's not going to happen. And we're just going to continue on with what we continue to see.
Yeah. And one thing that Amy Gore from Think Tennessee, which is a national-based think tank, they're kind of big picture, looking at public policy. One of the things that she said is that in response to NIMBYism is that faith-based organizations and churches can use their moral authority, their influence by going to public meetings and speaking out and saying we need to be more compassionate. We need to take care of people, and that they can actually play a positive role in the public debate by using their influence and goodwill to change people's minds and hearts.
Which does seem to be what Justice Knox is attempting to do.
It is exactly what Justice Knox is attempting to do, and they do show up at public meetings from time to time and do and talk about these issues. And I think that Gore was saying, do more of that.
Right. Well, I mean, I can say, when I worked at the city, and of course we dealt with some of these issues then, because these issues have been around for a long time. Sometimes we in the administration would have some frustration with that, because you would see instances come up where there was a proposal and the only people who showed up at the meeting to talk about it were people who lived nearby and were against it. And so then, some months later, like advocates for homeless people would come and be mad at the mayor about something. And one of the things we would say sometimes is, okay, like, I hear what you're saying, but like, where were you? Like, we just had a meeting 3 months ago where it would have made a big difference to have 20 people in the audience supporting this, and there was nobody there. And so, right, if you want to be engaged, that's great, but you actually have to be engaged at the places where it counts. So I guess so the next step in this will be this 5-year plan.
Right. Well, they're going to be continuing to get input from other methods. I mean, it's not they're not just taking what they talked about at the summit and going into the office and hunkering down for the next few months writing this. They're going to be doing some other outreach efforts and all. And I think that if they want to be successful at it, that's probably a wise thing to do, especially with that buy-in, that anti-NIMBY buy-in that they need, reaching out to neighborhood organizations and business organizations and things like that to try to get buy-in from them and input from them. And that's again, that goes back to the theme that emerged from this whole thing, which was collaboration. We need to work together to do all these things. That's kind of the big takeaway from this, is that if the community wants to make a difference and reduce, if not eliminate, aspects of homelessness, then they've got to work together.
Right. All right. Well, okay. We've talked about homelessness, racial disparities, Gaza, and utility poles. Let's talk about something fun. Big Ears is here. We are taping this, as you said, on Thursday, which is the first day of the Big Ears Festival. This episode will be released on Sunday, which is the last day of the Big Ears Festival. So there will still be some things going on Sunday. If you haven't had the opportunity to get out, there is stuff to do, including there are free things happening all over town as part of Big Ears. There are art exhibits and and some musical performances and so forth. So you can find all that online. But Scott, we always have to say when we talk about Big Ears, I have a conflict here, which is that my wife is the director of development for Big Ears Festival, and she loves working for Big Ears. And so all I will say about that is that I was a huge Big Ears fan before she went to work for them. My wife's engagement with this, I don't even get a free pass from it because I get the same media pass that I was getting before she worked at Big Ears. I'm not being personally directly paid by Big Ears in any way, although I won't deny that it has some impact on our household income. Nevertheless, Big Ears, hooray. You talked to Ashley Capps, of course, the founder of Big Ears and the engine behind the whole thing. What did he tell you about this year's festival?
Well, the thing he talked about this year's festival is what he talks about almost all the time. Every year he talks about how how important it is to have a sense of adventure, and an openness to new things, because it is an eclectic collection of performers. He gets to come here to Big Ears, and he talked about that this year he really is really focused a lot on American music. A lot of times it's international music, and there's some of that here. But and he talked about the melting pot of American music and all the different types of music, jazz and Americana and rock and roll and all kinds of everything in between. And he was real enthusiastic about the lineup. We've got Herbie Hancock is coming, John Batiste, Laurie Anderson's coming back, Andre 3000. It's just a lot of Rhiannon Giddens, a lot of really marquee acts, and then a lot of other acts that a lot of people might not be familiar with, but they do some interesting work. One of the things about that Caps always does is he brings in some interesting performances. I mean, you might like some, you might not like, but you go from venue to venue and check it out. And for instance, this year he's got a performer named Molly Lewis, who's a whistler.
Uh-huh.
She whistles, but she's really good. She did whistling in the Barbie movie this year, and she's got videos and out and all kinds of things. So it's they're all kinds of interesting, and not only the musical performers, but he's brought in Steve Keen, who is an artist, and he basically paints, in a rapid clip, 40, 50, 60 paintings a day, does it in public, so you can watch him work and buy them right from him. And it's fairly inexpensive. It's, this quick fire painting for the masses. And he's going to be here doing it all 4 days. And there's that. There's the film festival, or a film series that is really that Ashley really likes. He's got a documentary filmmaker who curates that, and so a lot of them are music films, but a lot of them aren't. There's he mentioned one called Carpet Cowboys, which is a documentary film about the carpet industry, of all things, in Dalton, Georgia, which is the carpet it's the carpet center of the universe, or the center of the carpet universe, I guess. So, there are all kinds of things. There's the another, and there's a interesting thing where he's bringing in. He got all of the poets laureate of the city of Knoxville, all four that have held that position, are going to have a reading. Things like that. It's a really varied experience. Everybody has a different experience with Big Ears, because you go. Everybody has their own itinerary. You go because all these shows are happening at the same time. It creates conflict within yourself. You might want to see two acts that are playing at the same time, and you got to pick one. But you also can go and go from to see these acts that you've never seen before, never heard of before, and just be wowed. And I think that's an experience that everyone has who goes to Big Ears. They may go. There may be people who come to Big Ears primarily to see Herbie Hancock, or some of the any of the other headliners. But they go see other shows, and shows that they never of acts that they never heard of before, and just come away big fans. So that's a common Big Ears experience, and one that Caps really encourages.
Well, and I have to say, one of my favorite things about it, beyond the musical and artistic experiences you can have, is just the experience of the city during Big Ears. I find really enjoyable the way it really uses all of downtown, because it's got venues scattered all over the city. And that, I think, makes it very different from most music festivals, which, of course, and most music festivals deal with much larger, like the Jazz and Heritage Festival in New Orleans is bringing the Rolling Stones and, 100,000 people or whatever. Like, this is operating deliberately at a different scale, because these aren't mostly those kinds of artists. But, the fact that you can see a really nice jazz show at the Bijou, and then walk up the street, maybe grab a cup of coffee or a sandwich on the way, and then go see, a heavy metal band at the Mill and Mine or something, and then leave that and walk over to St. John's Cathedral and see just like beautiful meditative, classical music or minimalist jazz performance or something. Like it really kind of, it transforms, or I guess it doesn't transform downtown so much as kind of it superimposes this almost other dimension on top of downtown. And I know that one thing that Ashley and I think a lot of us who have been boosters of Big Ears for a long time really enjoy about the festival is getting to see other people come here and discover our city and enjoy it and appreciate it. And it forces you out into the city because, the venues are where the performances happen, but then where you're going to eat or get a drink or stay at our hotels. Our downtown hotels are always booked solid during this weekend. It just really makes Knoxville into kind of this magical place. And it's especially fun, I think, for those of us who actually live here to see that transformation happen.
Yeah. Camps will tell me 75% of their the guests who come to Big Ears come from other states or other countries. So yeah, it kind of shows off Knoxville, and it's one of the things that he really likes about it, and quite frankly, I think it's everybody, like you said, who likes Big Ears and is jazzed about it being here. They look at it and say, "Yeah, we get to show Knoxville off." And he said that Knoxville is one of the few places you can actually put this on because our downtown is very compact. There are a lot of great venues of varying sizes within walking distance of one another. So unlike, say, Bonnaroo, which is, all held in one place out in the countryside in the field, you've got all these different venues literally feet away from one another. And and one of the great things about this too is you can go to a show of say it's a group you never heard of, and they turn out to be a big metal band, and you don't like you're more of a jazz person. You don't like you can turn around and walk out and go down the street to a different show, and you come and go into these shows. I mean, there have been times when I've been at Big Ears and gone to 3 different shows within an hour.
Yep.
And not all of it because I dislike something. It's because there are 2 performers at the same time. I'll catch the first part of one show, say at St. John's Cathedral, catch the first part of that show, then go over to the Bijou and catch the second half of another show that's happening at the same time. That way, I get to at least see some of both performers, and it's that really, and that's how you create your own experience at this festival, and that wouldn't be possible anywhere else. I mean, everybody talks about, well, we're getting all this music from around the world coming here. Wouldn't it make more sense for this to be in New York, for example? Well, yeah, but you can't walk from one place to another within a couple of minutes in New York, one venue to another in just a couple of minutes. That you lived in Manhattan. That you need to take the subway or take a cab to get from one venue to another.
Get caught in crosstown traffic. Yeah,
it just wouldn't work, and so that's why a compact downtown with a variety of interesting venues is part of the festival.
Yeah, for sure. Well, as we said, we are taping this on Thursday afternoon, so it hasn't started yet, but I'm very excited for it. I've got my schedule sort of mapped out with a whole bunch of irreconcilable conflicts that I have no idea how I'm going to end up dealing with. But, that's part of the fun, what you can see, what you can't see. You just kind of you have to take that pressure off of yourself and just be like, I'll see what I see. And, there'll be a lot of stuff I don't, and that's okay. So before we end this and hopefully get out into that and enjoy it, quick look ahead to the coming week. Not a whole lot on the official civic calendar. County Commission is meeting Monday at 5 o'clock in the main assembly room of the City County building. And as we talked about earlier, they will be voting on that resolution and ordinance having to do with the utility poles. So we'll see what happens there. And we will be back next week to talk about that and anything else that has happened in the interim. But for now, I guess we can go enjoy Big Ears. Hey, one thing we should say is that, often at the end of our episodes here, we'll say thanks to Lord Seth Barber for his production assistance and to local musician Will Wright, who wrote our theme music. And Will Wright himself is playing at Big Ears this year, right, Scott?
He sure is. In fact, I was able to sit down with Will a few days ago and talk with him about that. And, he's been around for, quarter century making music in Knoxville. And it's got a real, varied and interesting sounds that he's done. And it's just a fascinating interview. And hopefully we'll that is our plan anyway, to have that for everybody on Monday. And
right. Let's see what his Big Ears experience was like.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you're going to Big Ears, I hope you're enjoying it. If you're not going to Big Ears, I hope you're enjoying whatever it is that you're doing. And we will be back next week to talk to you.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost in Agreement. Almost in Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostinagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.